Hi, Glenn.
Hello, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Let me introduce this. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available via both streaming video and audio podcasts. You're Glenn Greenwald, famous Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. Do you affirm that as well?
I do, enthusiastically.
And you write a lot for The Intercept, very, shall we say, prominent voice on Twitter. And we're going to talk about, I want to talk about, whatever we wind up talking about is fine, but the aftermath of the Mueller report, and I hope we get into some related matters like the dynamics of social media, the psychology of tribalism, the merits or lack thereof of the so-called resistance, and so on. But let us start. Now, it's well known that you were a Russiagate skeptic from the beginning. You didn't think it very likely that we were going to find some kind of smoking gun, that things were nearly as dark as they were being presented. And I think it's safe to say that since the Mueller report failed to establish, as it put it, I guess conspiracy or coordination with the Russian government on the part of the Trump campaign, you have not concealed the fact that your view is consistent with those findings. And before we talk about that, I want to share with the audience an exchange we had before we started taping. So you said, I'm not sure which of my microphones is working. And I said, well, there's a way to find out. And I said, you take your cursor down to the bottom and you blah, blah, blah. And you said, wait, Bob, I've got a better way. You tapped on your microphone. And I said, yeah, that seems to be working. And then you said, and Bob, I want you to admit that I was right, my way was better, and you were wrong. Now, Glenn, there are people who would say that you don't always have to point that out to people. But
right. But Bob, just in my defense, which I think is part of your point, that I tend to think in those terms, I was being pretty frivolous, right? Like it was just more of a joke at your expense about the fact that you had this very complicated, technologically sophisticated manner for confirming the viability of my microphone, and my way was very kind of primitive, and yet mine was more effective. It was really just more of a joke than I think it was some kind of insistence that you acknowledge my superior wisdom.
But you see the aptness as a metaphor.
I do. And then you made that clear that you saw that as an excellent vista for some of the things you wanted to talk about.
So, first of all, let's just quickly start out there. There's a group of you who were kind of on the same page during the Mueller report, I guess. Aaron Maté, Michael Tracy, I don't know what other people.
Matt Taibbi.
Right.
We kind of joked that there was like about 10 of us, 5 on the left and 5 on the right, like Chuck Ross at the Daily Caller, who, despite being at the Daily Caller, which a lot of people hate, did some extremely great reporting. Same with Molly Hemingway at the Federalist. There were, I would say a small group of sustained skeptics doing what we at least regarded as journalism, meaning following the evidence.
Wasn't the group on the right larger, though? I would think that it was kind of the default position on the right was skeptical.
I think there was some tribalism that just said, we don't care about this, we don't believe this. I'm talking about people who really dug in forensically and journalistically to the story. That was a small group. Just like, there were huge numbers of people who are Democrats who were just saying, yeah, Trump's a Russian agent and Trump colluded with Russia, without really doing the work to dig into the story, write about it, report on it. They were focused on other things, which is a legitimate choice. I don't mean there were only 5 people on the right who were skeptics. There were 5 people on the right who were journalists who were digging into the story from the opposite direction as most of the media.
Okay. So anyway, one upshot of all this is that if we define the left broadly, it's just kind of left of center. Liberals and the left and everyone, there is a certain amount of division in the aftermath of this. Conceivably division that could become a problem as the general election approaches. I don't know. And all the people who would like to unseat Trump are kind of bitterly divided if they are. So I figured who better to bring healing than me, right? So that's what we're going to do today, Glenn. We're going to start the process of healing.
Great. You know, I'm a big fan of your meditation book and your Buddhism book. So
Yeah.
there's a part of me that tries to be harmonious as well.
But are you a fan of healing?
I am. You know, I mean, obviously, I don't think I heal in all cases. But I think healing is good in some cases. Sometimes polarization, debate, and division are positives.
Okay.
I was just actually talking to Andrew Kaczynski, who wrote this huge profile of Bernie Sanders, and we were talking about the fact that he has this very kind of cantankerous, unpleasant side to him, and we discussed whether that was a necessary component of the personality type that challenges power, like Julian Assange and other people. But but I also do believe that there's a place for healing and that sort of thing as well.
I mean, Sanders actually brings up a particular issue. Is it possible? Do you worry that, the things that some liberals don't like about your voice in the aftermath of the Mueller report release are things they will associate with Sanders, because you're viewed as kind of a Sanders supporter. I don't know if you've come out officially, and I think that's true in general of the people on the left who were loudly skeptical of the report, and haven't concealed that fact since the report. A lot of them are Sanders supporters. Is that a concern that this will deepen hostility towards Sanders on the left of center?
So it's interesting. I mean, Bernie definitely was not a Russiagate skeptic. He kind of recited from the standard Democratic script, not very frequently or enthusiastically, but kind of obligatorily, because I think he calculated probably correctly that you can't be a Russiagate skeptic if you have any chance of winning the nomination. But it clearly wasn't his animating issue, right? He'd much rather talk about millionaires and billionaires than Putin and the Kremlin and the like. And, I would just say two things that I think are really interesting about this. One is, I mean, for me, politics is not about healing. Politics is about working out differences of ideology, policy perspectives, preferences of how power and resources are to be disseminated. And I've never understood this idea that we should try and eliminate the use of politics as a vessel for resolving our ideological disputes. I certainly understand the call for turning down the temperature sometimes, making it less hostile and perhaps toxic and destructive, but not this idea that we should pretend that we don't have differences. And so there is a real rift on what you defined as the left, meaning center of left, establishment liberals, the kind of Sanders left, the AOC left. There's real divisions about ideas. And internationally, in Europe and throughout the democratic world, here in Brazil as well, you see this kind of unraveling of traditional left-right divisions where in some senses, sometimes the populist left and the populist right have more in common than the establishment left and the establishment right on questions like neoliberalism, intervention wars, trade, a whole variety of things. So I think part of it is that, right? Like this kind of hostility is grounded in legitimate differences of policy perspective. Mm-hmm. And then obviously the 2016 primary was very hostile and contentious, not as hostile and contentious, people forget, as the 2008 war between Obama and Clinton, where there was a lot less at stake ideologically, yet was way more vicious than the Bernie-Hillary war. But sure, the Democrats, this is what I think is the key, is you have Donald Trump, and not just Trump, but like, again, in the UK, in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Latin America, this rising tide of right-wing nationalism that I think comes from anger towards the failure of neoliberalism. And so there's going to be a big, important war and debate about what ought to be the alternative. What is the alternative that can defeat this movement and can defeat Donald Trump? Is it Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Beto O'Rourke, people who kind of seem to believe generally in the prevailing status quo institutions with some incremental reform needed? Or is it going to be something that's more radical as a difference? It's a really critical question that people ought to use the primary to vigorously debate.
Right. I think it's true that, I mean, the politics have been scrambled by Trump, or at least he represents a kind of scrambling of traditional ideological lines. And in fact, he could have taken his electoral victory, and a different kind of person could have used his mandate to pursue a different set of policies and really complicated the ideological landscape. He could have gone more left-wing economic nationalist. He could have stayed true to his campaign pledge to be a non-interventionist militarily, and so on. So,
well, that was Steve Bannon's plan, right? And that is, for me, the question of, I mean, how do you? He eventually, Steve Bannon got pushed out by Jared Kushner and by Mnuchin and other kind of like traditional Republican oligarchs. But that kind of Steve Bannon framework of saying, let's close the borders and keep out foreigners, but then in a populist way, redistribute wealth from the billionaires who have their ideology, their allegiance to this transnational globalist elite class. Let's use their money to make the lives of working families better. That's a really potent political appeal. And I think you need to come up with an equally potent political appeal in order to defeat it, and saying, hey, let's reform things on the margins, obviously doesn't work. And we see the proof over and over, not just in the US in 2016, but in multiple countries, that you need something much grander than that to defeat that combination. But imagine if Trump had sat down with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer as his first act and did a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure deal that repaired bridges and highways and put people to work the way Steve Bannon wanted, and then raised taxes on the rich. Yeah. Which also Steve Bannon wanted. The Trump presidency would look a lot different. And if you get someone with Trump's ideology who's a more effective and less kind of repellent person, that's a really effective and scary prospect. And I think the project of figuring out how to beat that is what the center left has to focus on first and foremost.
Right. I was actually afraid he'd be a lot more crafty in that respect and consolidate his power and use it to ill. I also think this is not unrelated to the perception of you, because, well, let's back up and say that, social media is weird. You put out one tweet, a bunch of different people see it. Some of them have no idea, what your background is, what other things you've said, what the context is. And I'm sure you're aware of the fact that sometimes people just see something you said and they, about the Mueller report. And because you're a skeptic, they say, oh, a Trump supporter, because we live in such tribal times that's generally the way things break down. If and so there's that problem. And then there's the fact that you are actually genuinely sympathetic to some things Trump said he would do. And so sometimes you send those kinds of signals, right? And it's all kind of confusing. Right?
I mean, I think social media first and foremost brings out the worst in all of us. I remember during 2016, I did a series of podcasts with people who have hardcore Democratic partisan audiences. So the kind of people who would generally not be supportive of the work that I do. I did a podcast, for example, with Tommy Vietor on Pod Save America. You don't get bluer and more Democratic than that. I did one with Brian Butler at the New Republic. I did two with Isaac Chotney when he was still at Slate. And overwhelmingly, I just got all kinds of emails and tweets and other things saying, oh, wow, you seem so much more reasonable and so much more rational and so much of a better person and better human being than I ever realized listening to you on those shows than I get the impression from reading your tweets. And I think that in general, social media is a really toxic influence. And that is a really interesting example of how tribal and ideological lines are eroding. One of Matt Stoller, who is, kind of a hardcore leftist, anti-monopolist, anti-Silicon Valley activist. His favorite senator on these issues is Josh Hawley, this far right-wing senator from Missouri who beat Claire McCaskill. He went to Harvard Law School. He's like this younger generation, super educated, super smart, but very right-wing senator. And he just gave this really fascinating speech for 15 minutes about what is happening to our social, psychological, and emotional fabric as a result of our becoming a country dependent upon social media, where Twitter, Facebook, and Google are the drivers, not just of our politics and discourse, but also our economy. And my friend, the leftist journalist Johan Hari, wrote a book earlier this year about the roots of depression, where he said, why is it that in this digital age where the promise that the internet was going to connect us all and connect humanity more than ever, we actually feel more atomized and separated than ever before. And as a result, depression and suicide and anxiety and mental disorders and mental health problems are rising in exactly the places where the internet is most predominant. I think these are really interesting questions. I know myself, I've tried a lot to reduce my Twitter usage or to change my Twitter usage because I do think it fosters the worst in all of us. And it's not just me. I think in general, it degrades discourse and it brings out the worst in people.
Have you ever tried to kind of change your tone of voice, so to speak?
I mean, I think one of the problems is that, yes, I have. I think one of the problems is that the nature of Twitter in particular, because of the space constraints, kind of forces you to eliminate nuance and be much more direct and blunt about your point. Otherwise, you just run out of space and can't really make it. It's also a very confrontational media, right? So the idea of it is that anybody can just tell you why, you're evil or why you're stupid or why you're wrong. And, I think it's important to remember, I come from new media. I began writing about politics not in 1992 by working for the New York Times or graduating Columbia Journalism School, but by creating my own blog. And the thing I loved most about new media was this kind of egalitarian interaction where my readers, who often were anonymous and had no credentials, would tell me, hey, you have this logical fallacy in your article, or you've made this factual mistake, or here's a piece of evidence that bolsters what you're saying. And I believe strongly in this kind of dialogue model of journalism. So instead of this kind of I'm speaking from the mountaintop as this journalistic expert, never hearing any critics or any people who don't like what I'm saying. So it's kind of a two-way street. Part of what I loved about Twitter in the beginning was that it was so egalitarian. It gave voice to people who otherwise don't have big platforms. But on the other hand, it can kind of drag you into the mud and it becomes confrontational and toxic. And then before you know it, you're becoming a more toxic and hostile voice than you might want to be.
Yeah. Although you clearly by nature kind of like a good fight, right? I mean, when I see your tweets, sometimes I wonder if you are like blessed with indifference to how you're perceived. That would be, because for me, concern about how you're perceived can be a very paralyzing thing. I mean, I honestly don't tweet all that much. And one reason is that I'm just always like, oh, there's all these different people out there. Some are going to misconstrue it. The other thing is, first of all, you and I, especially in foreign policy, I think we have the same rough idea of who the bad guys are. Yeah. I feel as hostilely toward them as you feel. Right. But I guess two things. Sometimes I think, wait a second, you don't know for sure what their motivation is. And, and I think that stuff is all true. And that probably enlightenment does involve always taking that into account. But also it's just like, it's weird. I'm like a naturally hostile person, but I don't enjoy confrontation. Whereas it seems like you are a naturally hostile person who enjoys confrontation. Am I wrong about that?
This is a very complicated topic, right? And as human beings, we're all complicated and we all have different sides to us. So I think, again, part of it goes back to the origins of how I began developing a political and public voice, which was, again, I didn't work for the New York Times. I didn't have the benefit of NBC megaphone. So when I began blogging and wanting to critique powerful people, I kind of needed to raise my voice and use guerrilla tactics in order to be heard, in order to break through this media and political wall that, especially in 2005, 2006, the time of George Bush and post 9/11 patriotism, was really difficult to penetrate. Yeah. So part of it is that. Part of it is, I think you're right that by nature, my personality tends to be more combative. I remember, I was on the debate team in high school and college. I went to law school. I was a New York litigator in the very rough world of Manhattan litigation prior to becoming a journalist. I do like debate and confrontation. I think that truth often comes from clashes of ideas. I generally don't take it personally. But I would say, I think that one of the problems we have in American discourse is that people in power are treated often too respectfully rather than too disrespectfully. So, for example, I think that in general, it's considered almost taboo to identify respected American leaders of national security institutions or people who are elected presidents as, say, war criminals, even when they are actually war criminals. We didn't want to call what the U.S. government during the war on terror was doing torture, because torture seems like too harsh of a word to use for our respected leaders. So I think that people in power often need greater levels of hostility and disrespect. It's an important way of checking and challenging and kind of bringing down a few notches those who wield power. But, I try and be, especially as I grow older, a more complete person. So I try and make certain, that I try not to punch down with hostility. I don't always succeed. Sometimes I do. And I think that's part of the perils of Twitter. But, in my life, I dedicate myself to things like, a homeless run dog shelter that I build, or the 2 kids that I've adopted, or meditation and Buddhism, as you and I have discussed in the connection with your book, or my husband's political career and the ways in which he's trying to be a voice for people who are voiceless in Brazil. So I think we all have different sides to us, and or at least we should, and sometimes hostility and confrontation are very positive things, that they're things that are required for challenging authority in effective ways. It's just that you need to wield it wisely and selectively, and I'm sure I don't do that perfectly, but I strive to kind of pick and choose when I use it.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk a little about your initial grounds for Russiagate skepticism, because I wouldn't call myself, I wouldn't say I was a Russiagate skeptic. I would say I was a determined agnostic. And, if I could, I had this newsletter, the Mindful Resistance newsletter, which, by the way, people can subscribe to at mindfulresistance.net. And whenever I kind of preached about this, I said, look, we haven't seen a smoking gun. There may or may not be one. The report will eventually come out. Then we'll know. And there's no point. Not only is it a distraction from more important things to be too obsessed with this whole thing, but if we join in the kind of standard resistance voice and hail every every piece of news on this front as a smoking gun, when in fact, if you look at it closely, it's not, we're just going to raise expectations about what Mueller is going to find. And then if he doesn't find anything, it's going to have been tactically unwise. So my view was almost more tactical and kind of just a standpoint of like epistemological humility or something. You seemed more actually convinced from the beginning that there was not going to be a smoking gun, that there was not going to be a there. Am I right about that?
I mean, I think it's a fair critique. I mean, a fair characterization by degree. So let me just say 2 things about that. One is that from the beginning, you can go back to late 2016, I was saying, and I wasn't just saying this in a cursory way or to say it because it was the right thing to say tactically. I was saying it because I really believed it. What I kept saying was because every day there was a new leak. Like the Washington Post would talk to somebody at the CIA, New York Times would talk to somebody at the FBI. There'd be a new claim that you couldn't falsify and you couldn't verify about Trump and Russia. Mm-hmm. And it was driving me crazy because everybody was unhinged and running around like their hair was on fire over claims that were being made by invisible people that was unaccompanied by evidence, who belong to agencies that have a very long history of deceiving and misleading, or just being in error, even if they're not trying to deceive and mislead. And so my view always was, the only way we're ever really going to know is if we have a comprehensive investigation with somebody who is trusted and armed with subpoena power. And then at the end, they produce a comprehensive report and we can see all the evidence, and then we'll finally know what really was going to happen. That's always what I wanted, because I didn't want to be driven by and manipulated by and have our discourse drowned with CIA and FBI selective calculated leaks that nobody could ever verify. So I was on board with you on that. It was not, oh, I know this didn't happen. It was, I want to find out. There definitely, though, was a component of it where I was actively skeptical, in part because and I've realized this recently, my politics was formed, in the 1970s and 1980s. So my hero was Daniel Ellsberg. I was born in the Cold War. I kind of came of age during the Reagan era when the Soviet Union ended and the Cold War was over. So the whole kind of script of like, this person is a secret Kremlin agent, Moscow is infiltrating American politics, the kind of maximalist conspiracy theories, just coming from the FBI of all places, that's to this day is still named the J. Edgar Hoover headquarters. It just instinctively repelled me,
right.
It felt so just intuitively toxic in a really familiar way, even though the ideology of Russia has obviously changed. And then on top of that, obviously a major part of my politics and my journalism is skepticism of the very agencies that were originating this storyline. So I did feel a natural hostility toward it because I was hearing a lot of fantastical claims without seeing any evidence from people that I don't trust. That was a storyline in the script to which I feel hostility. So I think you're right that it was more than just agnosticism. It was an active form of skepticism that until you show me evidence that this happened, which thus far you haven't, I'm not going to believe it. And then the only other thing I would say was you can go back to like February and March of 2017. So like the second and third month of the Trump administration when Trump Russia was already all the rage and people were convinced that any day they were coming to take Trump and Kushner and Steve Bannon and Trump Jr. out in handcuffs. Pro-Clinton, anti-Trump security state officials like James Clapper and Michael Morrell were warning. They were inside these agencies and they were warning publicly. They were saying, there's no smoking gun for any of this. There's no real evidence that this happened. So there's some smoke, but we haven't seen any fire. So don't get your hopes up about this stuff, that this is the silver bullet that's going to take out Trump. And that was a lot of what convinced me that this is going to go nowhere for Democrats, that even people sympathetic to their cause who hated Trump were trying to warn them not to be misled by, demagogues like Rachel Maddow and others, that this is going to be the thing that they should monomaniacally focus on because it was going to ultimately take down Trump and his political family.
Right. There were also some kind of unfortunate, well, from our point of view, I guess, ideological ramifications of getting too obsessed with it. In other words, I mean, one of the first things that bothered me about intense kind of Russiagate obsession was whenever I hear I'm kind of anti-xenophobia generally, and whenever I hear anyone say so-and-so is some kind of foreign agent of some kind of foreign power, I just kind of react against that. And not to mention the fact that the extreme version of this, the Manchurian Candidate, the P-tape, that was all always highly dubious from the beginning. And then there's the second fact that, traditionally intense hostility toward Russia is a right-wing position. It's a Cold War position. Its primary champions today are neoconservatives. And, the psychology of tribalism is such that if you really hate somebody like Trump and you associate him with Russia, if your most intense hatred is toward Trump, then everything you associate with him, you're going to hate. So suddenly we had all this hatred of Russia, which, first of all, could complicate cases where Russia could be helpful in resolving problems, conceivably in Syria, conceivably now in Venezuela, who knows?
In Iran, right? Obama worked with Putin a lot on the Iran deal.
They were very helpful. They signed on to the deal. They joined in the sanctions regime that led to the nuclear deal, and so on. So there's that. And then there's the related fact that the whole Russiagate became a vehicle, one of the vehicles by which neocons like Bill Kristol endeared themselves to the resistance, to liberals, in a way that no doubt, I mean, the Twitter followings, their social media power grew immensely by joining the resistance and which included playing this particular note. They wound up suddenly, you turn on MSNBC, Ari Melber has got like Bill Kristol in a warm embrace, figuratively speaking. And so all of this was kind of an issue for me.
Bob, this is so critical. And I think that this is part of the thing that has gotten most overlooked and has definitely been a major component of my view of it. And actually, I know he doesn't exist for a lot of people because he's not on Twitter or online, but like Noam Chomsky, who, you know, if you want to talk about ideological identity or whatever, has about as good of a bona fide record of being a leftist as it gets, was always his view as well, which is it is a really dangerous thing to ratchet up tensions between Russia and the U.S., even though they're still now not the Soviet Union, because there are still thousands of intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear tips aimed at one another's cities with hair trigger warning systems that are archaic. Even if you don't want a nuclear war, misperception and miscommunication, which happens, for example, when you create a climate where people are afraid to talk to Russians because it's viewed as treasonous, is what has brought those two. Obviously, no one wants a nuclear war, but in the past, when we've come closest to it, which we have on at least 2, probably 3 occasions, very, very close to annihilating the species, those two countries, has been because of misperception, misunderstanding, and miscommunication. So escalating tensions between those two countries is a very dangerous thing to do. And then there's this background ideological framework that people have really overlooked, which is the difference between Barack Obama on the one hand and Hillary Clinton on the other. Obama's position in general in foreign policy and toward Russia in particular, ironically, is very close to Trump's. Obama never wanted to confront or provoke Putin. He told both Democrats and Republicans who demanded that he send lethal arms to the Ukrainians, are you crazy? I'm not going to arm Ukrainians right on Russia's border, one of the countries most important to them historically, because that's their neighborhood and not ours. And I'm not going to provoke Putin by doing that. I'm not going to provoke Putin by unleashing the CIA to remove the client regime that he has in Syria. I'd rather work with Russia to agree on a list of terrorist targets of ISIS and Al-Qaeda that we can jointly fight against as part of the war on terror. He constantly tried to say, stop with all of this, you know, unhinged rhetoric about Russia being this grave threat to the U.S. when its economy is smaller than Italy's. Hillary Clinton, to the extent she was critical of Obama, and she wasn't that second book she wrote, I think it was Hard Choices or Decisions or whatever that she wrote in preparation for her run, when she was critical of Obama, it was generally because he was insufficiently bellicose and militaristic when it came to confronting Russia. She wanted to arm the Ukrainians. She wanted to take out Assad. She, of course, was the one who wanted, along with Samantha Power and Susan Rice, mostly against Obama's wishes, to do regime change in Libya. So they're way before Trump ever became a possibility or even announced his candidacy. There were articles that you can find in the New York Times in 2014 about how the neocons were going to migrate back to the Democratic Party in anticipation that Hillary was going to be much closer to their militaristic ideology than what they viewed correctly as this kind of isolationist, anti-war sentiment growing again in the Republican Party, as evidenced, for example, by the popularity of Ron Paul and even Rand Paul and some of the Tea Party leaders who are very isolationist in that kind of Charles Lindberghian manner. So that was always a major concern of mine, was that what this was doing was there was this whole generation of liberals and Democrats who previously were apolitical, who were paying attention to politics for the first time due to fear of Trump, who were being inculcated by MSNBC with this neoconservative ideology, this language that comes from like Bill Buckley and J. Edgar Hoover and Joseph McCarthy, of calling everybody traitors and treasonous and being loyal to, as you said, foreign powers. It was a very jingoistic ethos that this resistance took on, grounded in this hostility toward Russia. Everybody who was a Russian got viewed in a kind of bigoted and xenophobic way as being sinister and nefarious. And I thought it was incredibly dangerous, both geopolitically, but then also in a domestic sense, ideologically, because of this reintegration of neocons back into the Democratic Party from which they, as people might recall, originated. And that was always the broader ideological context for my concern about all this.
Yeah. And actually, the political pressure that was placed on Trump by Russiagate, I think, led him to a fairly confrontational policy with Russia that has not been noted. I mean, he did arm, right? He did send arms to Ukraine, and yet people persist in saying, look at what a dupe of the Kremlin Trump is. And, you know, by and large, he hasn't been. He's ratcheted up some sanctions and
also, how about the two other things about that. So sending arms, I mean, if you know anything about Russian history, right? Like, you know how critical Ukraine is to the security of Russia. I mean, in two different instances, it almost led to the obliteration of Russia in the 20th century. On top of which, you have the Trump administration right now trying to remove Russia's close ally in Venezuela, the Maduro government. And probably the thing that Trump personally did that was the most directly threatening, not to the ancillary, but the vital interest of Russia, is he's still doing it. He's successfully badgering Angela Merkel in Germany out of buying Russian natural gas based on the not unreasonable argument that we spend huge amounts of money of American taxpayer dollars on NATO to protect you, the Germans, who barely have a military. Why would you then turn around and use your money to buy natural gas from Russia instead of buying natural gas from American energy companies? And so he's badgering the Europeans out of buying Russia's most important export, which is natural gas, on top of which he's confronted them a little bit in Syria, a lot in Ukraine, a lot in Venezuela, in the Black Sea, on the Russian border, trying to put missile defense systems in Poland. You go down the list, and there's no question that the Trump administration has been more belligerent and more confrontational with the Russians than the Obama administration has, for whatever reasons. Yeah. Maybe he got pressured by Democrats. Maybe there's rogue elements in the administration that he doesn't control or care about that are doing it to spite him. Whatever it is, there's probably a mixture of different motives, but you can't deny that there's all kinds of adverse relations between U.S. and Russia that should just negate for any rational person that maximalist Putin controls Trump with blackmail leverage, PP tapes, money laundering evidence, or whatever. Just all the evidence negates for a rational person that theory.
Right. And I mean, I don't want to turn this into a foreign policy discussion, but, I want to be clear. It's not like I approve of Russia's behavior in Ukraine. I think sovereignty of nations should be respected by Russia and by us. But the fact is, it's not respected by us either. We, everything that bothers us about what Russia does in Ukraine is comparable to something we've done. And in fact, we define our legitimate sphere of influence much more broadly than they define theirs. I mean,
like
Ukraine,
the Monroe Doctrine.
What?
Yeah, the Monroe Doctrine. Imagine if Russia or Iran were sending huge amounts of lethal arms to Mexico to arm elements of Mexico that were directly hostile to the U.S. government. Imagine how provocative we would regard that as being.
Right. I mean, we may invade Venezuela, right?
Right, on the grounds that all of Latin America is ours to control.
Right. So anyway, that's kind of the argument, and I guess we won't get into the, although I actually think the role, the somewhat interventionist role we played in the change of government in Ukraine, in deposing a president, I think that actually, I think even Ben Rhodes, I heard him saying that there was evidence that our doing that had really intensified Putin's motivation to mess with our election. In any event, these are not unrelated things and not totally lacking in parallelism. So back to the whole healing thing. I mean, first of all, what do you say of the accusation that you guys have done a few too many victory laps or been too intent on insisting? Now, I understand that it must be frustrating from your point of view. Well, maybe this is another question. Maybe it's frustrating from your point of view that people on the other side are holding out and saying, no, there is the smoking gun. We just haven't found it. I mean, there are non-crazy versions of this, it seems to me. In other words, for example, the August meeting between Paul Manafort and Kilimnik, we don't know. There could have been more footsie there than is evident. Mueller kind of pointedly said he didn't have all the evidence. It could be that Manafort said, hey, yeah, we could, if Trump's president, we could support a peace plan that would be good for Russia. And hey, you guys want to help us out in the election? Fine. If it involves stolen emails, no problem. He could have said all that.
Totally.
So I guess you're not denying that. At the same time, I think you're frustrated by how doggedly people on the other side are hanging on to hopes that, or to the conviction that there's a really deep conspiracy that hasn't been unveiled. So maybe that's part of what's going on. But with that as the context for this question, do you, what about the argument that you've done too many victory laps, you and your team?
I mean, this whole thing of victory laps, look, I mean, we're all human beings, right? So having spent 3 years being called a Russian agent, not by like random Twitter trolls, but by very prominent people like Howard Dean, Malcolm Nance, who's always on MSNBC, Bob Shrum, who's run a bunch of Democratic presidential campaigns, and Joy Reid, who also has an MSNBC show. I mean, they've been actually accused of being an agent of the Russian government. But then just more generally being, you know, I had an 8,000 word profile in the New Yorker written about me, these kind of like subtle and insidious purpose of which was more or less to suggest that the reason I refuse to acknowledge what everybody who's rational can see is all this piled evidence of a Trump-Russia conspiracy is because I'm basically mentally unwell due to anger issues from having grown up gay and being alienated from society. Like a kind of a article intended to depict me as this sort of unstable, rage-filled, not very mentally balanced person, and just generally trying to be written out of, you know, decent liberal circles or whatever. Of course, like after 3 years when the Mueller report comes back and Trump Jr. and Kushner and sort of all the big bad guys are not actually even charged with crimes relating to this conspiracy, and then the Mueller report comes out and says essentially that there's not enough evidence to establish any of these theories, and in many cases that there's no evidence, and then in some cases like the platform change about Ukraine, that there's evidence that the whole narrative was wrong. Of course, on some level, there's a sense of vindication that I want to declare for myself and for the people with whom I've been working, who have, I think, been unfairly smeared and castigated. So I'm not going to deny that's a part of it. But look, the reality is that this has been the predominant political theme of the last 3 years. This has been the lens through which the Trump administration has been understood. Not exclusively. There's obviously been debates over the immigration abuses at the border and debates over healthcare repeal of Obamacare and the like, but by and large, this has been the predominant issue, as these things tend to be when there's a special counsel unleashed on an investigation with allegations this grave. So when you finally have the conclusion, if you believe, as I do, that the media got huge and important claims wildly wrong as a result of journalistically reckless practices, and that the political and media class have done all kinds of damage through pursuing this conspiracy theory that essentially has been debunked, and you think it's important that those institutions evaluate what it is that they did wrong that caused them to do all of this. And most importantly of all, if you believe, as I do, that this has been mostly about the Democrats wanting to beat Trump without having to do the hard work that we talked about at the beginning of coming up with an alternative to this failed neoliberal order that they've been so invested in for 3 decades now. Of course, there has to be some post, conclusion discussions and accountability. I mean, imagine, Bob, if John Brennan's prediction had been right and Jared Kushner and Trump Jr. had been carted off as Bob Mueller's final act, and he issued a report saying, we found all of this unknown evidence that there was, in fact, this Trump-Russia conspiracy. Do you think the people who were the advocates and proponents of that conspiracy would have forgotten it by now? Or do you think they would be taking quote-unquote victory laps, demanding that those of us who are skeptical acknowledge that we were wrong and examine what it is that we got wrong and publicly account for what they did? They'd be probably demanding that I commit suicide by slitting my own wrist on video. So I do think it's important, given the magnitude of what this issue has been, to talk about, now that it's more, that it should be concluded with the issuance of the Mueller report that everybody agreed was going to be the authoritative text on what didn't happen, to have discussions about who went wrong and who didn't, and why they went wrong and why they didn't, and what the consequences are. And calling that a victory lap, I think, is just a way of the people who got it wrong trying to demonize that attempt to hold them accountable and say, okay, just let's forget about this already and move on as though it was just no big deal all along. Okay. So you're not totally ready for the process of healing to begin?
I'm getting ready.
Look, how will we know? How will we know?
This is what I think. I think what's going to happen is more or less what happened with Benghazi, right? So, like, at the beginning of Benghazi, I was in favor of an investigation because an American ambassador got killed.
for whatever reasons, the government made some statements that weren't really accurate about why those riots began. I think that warrants an investigation, but it went way out of control. People became obsessive conspiracists about it on the right. Finally, we got to the point where after zillions of hearings and all kinds of reports, there was like this tiny nub of conspiratorial fanatics who to this day believe that Benghazi is some kind of major scandal as opposed to what it was, which is a very banal and trivial incident.
Hey Glenn, my dog is just knocking at the door. I'm gonna let him in, but
Sure.
keep talking, and then I want you to meet him.
Sure. So, I think that there's this tiny nub of people who never accepted the conclusions of what a rational person would conclude from Benghazi, who continue to believe that it was this massive conspiracy. And I think that's what we're going to have with Russiagate, like the Marcy Wheelers of the world, the Rachel Maddows of the world, Malcolm Nance's, the people who kind of went all in with it, Lawrence Tribe. They're going to continue to insist that this is the gravest crime in the history of humanity and that everybody else is going to essentially accept that the Mueller report found there was very little to this. That dog is awesome, and he's the perfect tool for healing. What's his name?
This is Milo, one of two dogs we have. Milo is like
he's very chill.
What's that?
He's very chill.
Not always, but he's a little nervous now. He's never been on TV before. Actually, he has a little, but he still freezes up a little when he sees a microphone.
I mean, yeah, it's not everybody is great in public, but yeah, he's done with his public opinion.
Now I got to open the door so he can get out. But
right.
so you mentioned Marcy Wheeler. Just quickly, my goal is to be present when you and Marcy have a civil tea, have tea together or something. But I do think, I really like her. I know things have gotten hostile between your team and her. I think whatever this thing she did, the controversial thing that she acknowledged was controversial, where there was some source she became convinced had done something criminal. I guess she brought it to the FBI's attention. I'm sure that was in good faith. I'm sure I still don't know what it was, but I'm sure she thought it was something serious and it was her duty to do it. So if the healing has begun, your job at this point is to either say nothing or say something nice.
No. I mean, look, I've said nicer things about Marcy over the past 3 months than she's been willing to say about me, and I'll do it again, which is like when we created the Intercept, we made a wish list of people that we wanted to hire, and her name was on like the top tier. And in fact, we did hire Marcy. We had John Cook at the time, who was the editor-in-chief. He couldn't quite come to terms with her about exactly how we would work with her, so it didn't work out, but it wasn't because of me. I thought she was exactly what the Intercept was created to do. I think that, I don't know, I think it was kind of what we were talking about before with Bernie and Julian Assange and people like that, how the exact attributes that lead you to do good things, like challenge authority, can also in some ways lead to bad. It's sort of like the universe always creates balance in all of us. So my combative personality is what led me to be willing to stand up to the NSA and the threats from the DOJ and publish Snowden documents and tell everyone to fuck off. But at the same time, maybe it makes me like not the most healing of presences in the public voice, right? So there's a balance to it. On the other hand, if you're too accommodating of everybody, then maybe you're not willing to pursue the kinds of debates that are needed. So one of the reasons I respect Marcy's work over the years is because she's so tenacious about connecting dots and finding hidden patterns, and has done that really well. Like everything, that virtue can have a downside, which is it can lead you into conspiratorial territory where you think you see things that really don't exist. And I think that's what happened in Russiagate, not in a way that destroys her voice permanently as a positive asset for our discourse, but in a way that I just think made her on the wrong side of this debate. I do think the question of her turning her own source into the FBI is a really significant story, not in terms of understanding or making judgments about Marcy herself, because for whatever reason, she still talks about it like she's the CIA director who it's the most sensitive secret in the world. And when she talked to you about it, she was like, I can't say more lest I jeopardize like she thinks she's like almost part of the Mueller team.
I kind of put her on the spot, and it's kind of an awkward situation.
I know, but it's like if you're going to publicly disclose something that significant and tell the world that you were justified in doing the one thing that journalists should never do, which is turn over your own source to the FBI, even with a subpoena, right?
Well,
journalists are expected to go to jail.
If you became convinced that a source had slaughtered 38 innocent people, you would notify authorities, right?
I would not act as a cop in my role as journalist. But if there was a situation that extreme, right, where I thought a source were misleading the public or were murdering people, and then I went to the FBI and turned in my own source and announced that I did that, I would tell the public why I did it. I would say, look, I did it because I found out that my source was murdering kids, and then unless I turned him into the FBI, he was going to continue to do it. I wouldn't be coy about it on the one hand and say, I did this thing because I found secret smoking gun evidence that as a journalist, I'm 2 years later still not going to tell you about, and let the Washington Post and journalism in general celebrate me for doing something quite extraordinary that might have a justification. But at the same time, I would say if I want to be celebrated for it, I owe the public an explanation as a journalist, especially now that the Mueller report is out, who it is I turned in, what it is that they did, and why I turned them in. And to this very day, she continues to refuse to do that. So that's the problem that I have.
I'm not sure my fostering of the healing process is going as I'd hoped. But someday, the last thing in her defense is, as far as her connecting the dots, I suspect, I haven't looked that closely, that if you look at the places where she thinks something big happened, they are the places where we really don't know, like that August meeting and so on. And who knows, but I don't know. Anyway,
Bob, just one thing on that. It's like, Bob Mueller investigated for 22 months. He had this massive team of like the most aggressive prosecutors in the world, an unlimited budget, no other cases that he was working on. And then he published this huge report. So if there's evidence in the world that's smoking gun evidence of any serious criminality on the part of Donald Trump and his close associates, you would expect either Bob Mueller to have indicted and charged them or to have included them in the report, and neither of those happened. That's what we know. There may be this other world that still remains hidden for some reason after the Mueller investigation. Of course, that anything's possible, right? But I can only talk about the evidence that we know.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain things that you really need to really know what happened. To some extent, the June meeting, this August thing, you really need Manafort to flip and tell you the truth. He didn't. So I don't know. I basically think we need to let this thing go. We may never know for sure. Clearly, the more Manchurian candidate-ish theories never held much water to begin with. And the other thing is, what wrongdoing there was. A lot of this stuff could, in principle, be explained in terms of motivation, not as a Trump campaign thing, but to the extent this stuff did happen. Manafort had his own personal financial incentives to want to help people out on the other side.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I always said from the beginning I thought Manafort was going to end up in prison because of his financial thing. Well, let me ask you this question. I'm just curious before we go about this, because until very recently, I was not a big proponent of or believer in the theories that mostly ended up in the right-wing precincts of Fox News and elsewhere. The people like John Brennan and Jim Comey and other like Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, those kind of people, Andrew McCabe, exploited and abused and politicized the spying powers of the NSA, FBI, and CIA for political ends of the time that J. Edgar Hoover did when he was at the helm of the FBI or the CIA, that they actually meddled in U.S. politics, domestic politics, using what are supposed to be law enforcement and spying powers. And with things like the revelation that they actually sent a woman who was pretty clearly a honeypot to talk to George Papadopoulos, they used Stephen Halper, a longtime CIA operative, to try and get dirt on Papadopoulos and other people in the Trump campaign, including Carter Page. I now do believe there are valid, credible questions about whether those agencies did things like knowingly use the Steele dossier to get a FISA warrant on Carter Page based on allegations that he was a Russian agent, which the Mueller report concluded there was no evidence for, in order to spy on the Trump campaign for political reasons. And I'm wondering if you regard those as at least credible enough questions to warrant an investigation. We are now going to have an IG report from the Justice Department about that, which is why that story got leaked to the New York Times about the honeypot to get ahead of it. But there do seem, Andrew McCabe ended up being fired because he lied to the FBI. there does seem to be some wrongdoing by these agencies in connection with the election. And I'm wondering if you regard that as troublesome or at least warranting.
You know a lot more about this stuff than I do. I both in terms of historical context and in terms of what actually happened here, because I haven't been paying that much attention. I do assume on the one hand that if the FBI hears what they initially heard, I guess via Australia, which is that we have reports that seem credible, that a country you consider an adversary has gotten this dirt and they're offering it, and possibly illegally, they're offering it to the campaign. I think it's not crazy to think that the FBI, more times than not, would just for generic reasons choose to launch an counterintelligence investigation. Beyond that, I haven't paid that much attention. And I think you're certainly pointing to a dynamic we should always keep track of, which is that, the security establishment, the FBI, it is populated by human beings who have their own biases. And no doubt Trump triggered a lot of those biases, for reasons I sympathize with. I find him creepy and scary. But at the same time, people in those jobs should do their best to play it straight. And it's worth finding out whether they did and what lines were crossed. I don't really know.
Right.
I don't know anything about this and shouldn't profess to.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I've become more convinced not that there was actual wrongdoing, but that there's a need to journalistically and also kind of legalistically and officially inquire into the origins of all of that, to who did what, and to see whether or not power was abused.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, hey, I appreciate you taking the time, Glenn. People, if there's anybody who doesn't know where they can find you on Twitter, it's at G Greenwald. I am at Robert Writer. That's WRIGHTER. It's kind of a pun, Glenn.
You're also at mindfulresistance.net.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Your plug earlier was so seamlessly interwoven into the discussion that I tried to
you might have missed it. It was so subtle.
Exactly.
And I appreciate you saying that. I think it's more evidence that the healing is about to begin. And maybe in our next conversation it will. Thanks a lot.
All right. And I'm going to go celebrate my being correct about the microphone testing issue. And I hope to talk to you again soon.
If you could tweet about that, I would really appreciate it, because I feel frankly ashamed.
I'm going to mock you for your very poor microphone testing skills.
I deserve it. Bring the heat.
All right, Bob.
Okay, take care.
Good talking to you. Bye.
Bye-bye.